Late in the afternoon, the street felt slow and quiet, like it was holding its breath. The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows across the road, and the small shops nearby were almost empty. Ethan stood close to his mother, holding the edge of her coat with one hand, his backpack hanging loose on his shoulder. They had just left the bus stop and were waiting to cross the street when a police car rolled to a stop nearby. The sound of tires on the road felt louder than normal. The officer stepped out, and his boots hit the ground with a hard sound that made Ethan flinch a little. The officer looked tall and serious, his face tight and his voice sharp when he spoke. He asked them to stop even though they had done nothing wrong. His words were loud enough for people nearby to hear, and a few heads turned toward them. Ethan felt his heart beat faster. His mouth went dry, but he stayed still and listened. His mother spoke, calmly asking what the problem was, but the officer cut her off and began asking questions again, his tone rough and impatient, as if he had already decided something about them. Ethan watched his mother's face. She looked worried but strong. She kept her back straight and her voice soft. The officer looked down at Ethan and asked his name, then asked where they were going. Ethan answered quietly, his voice small but clear. He said they were going home. The officer asked more questions, and each one felt heavier than the last. People across the street slowed their steps. A man at a shop door stopped to watch. A woman near a car leaned against it, pretending not to stare, but her eyes stayed fixed on the scene. Ethan could feel the attention like pressure on his skin. He wanted to disappear, but he also felt something else, a strange calm that surprised him. The officer asked if Ethan's father was around. Ethan swallowed and shook his head. Then, after a short pause, he said his father was in special forces and would return soon. The words came out soft and careful, as if he was protecting something important. For a moment there was silence. Then the officer laughed loud and sharp. It cut through the air and made Ethan's chest tighten. The laugh was not friendly. It was mocking, like the idea itself was a joke. The officer bent slightly and shook his head, smiling in a way that felt wrong. He said, "Kids say funny things and that." Ethan had a big imagination. A few people nearby exchanged looks. Some smiled awkwardly, others looked away. Ethan's face grew warm, but he did not cry. He did not shout. He simply stood there, holding his mother's coat tighter. His mother opened her mouth to speak, but stopped. She knew arguing would only make things worse. The officer kept talking, making jokes and asking if Ethan's father was a movie hero or a secret agent. Ethan felt scared, but deep inside, he felt sure about what he had said. His father had told him the truth many times, and Ethan believed him completely. The officer's voice grew louder and sharper as he spoke, and more people began to watch. The street that had been quiet now felt tense, like a rope pulled too tight. The officer asked again where Ethan's father was, and Ethan answered the same way, calm and honest. Said his father told him to wait right here. The officer smirked and rolled his eyes, but something changed in his expression. Just a little, as if curiosity had slipped through the cracks. The sun dipped lower, and the light turned golden, stretching across the road. A breeze passed through, carrying the sound of a distant engine. Ethan heard at first a low, steady sound coming closer. He did not move, but his eyes shifted toward the end of the street. His mother noticed and followed his gaze. The officer noticed too, but ignored it at first, still talking, still laughing, but the sound grew louder and closer. A dark shape appeared at the far end of the road, moving slowly and smoothly toward them. Ethan felt his shoulders relax, just a bit, his fear easing into something closer to hope. The officer finally glanced over his shoulder and frowned. His laughter faded and his voice lowered, though his words stayed sharp. He asked Ethan what he was looking at. Ethan did not answer. He just kept his eyes forward. The people watching grew quiet. Their whispers stopped as the vehicle came closer. The officer stood up straighter, his hand moving slightly toward his belt. His confidence shifted into caution. The air felt heavy, now filled with waiting. Ethan's heart still beat fast, but it no longer felt like panic. It felt like the moment before a door opens. The officer cleared his throat and looked back at Ethan and his mother, his tone changed, not softer, but unsure. He asked them to stay where they were, as if they had planned to move at all. The dark vehicle slowed as it reached them and stopped without noise. The engine hummed low and steady. The officer turned fully now, his face serious, his earlier smile gone. Ethan stood tall despite his small size, his fear mixed with a quiet strength. He did not understand fully, but trusted. The street was silent, every eye focused on the moment. The officer had laughed only minutes ago, but now his laughter felt far away, like something that did not belong here anymore. And in that stillness, before anything else happened, Ethan knew that whatever came next would change everything, and that the officer would soon understand that some stories are not jokes and some truths arrive quietly but with great weight. The silence that followed felt heavy and strange, like the street itself was waiting for something to happen. The officer stood still for a moment, his eyes moving from the dark vehicle back to Ethan and then to his mother. He cleared his throat and tried to return to his earlier tone, but it did not sound the same anymore. His voice was lower and slower, as if he was thinking carefully before each word. He asked again why they were standing there, and Ethan's mother answered politely, saying they were just waiting to cross the street. The officer nodded, but his eyes kept drifting toward the vehicle behind them. Ethan noticed this and felt a quiet sense of relief. Even though his hands were still shaking, he loosened his grip on his mother's coat just a little. The people watching nearby stayed silent. Now no one laughed, no one whispered. The mood had changed from curious to tense. The officer asked Ethan once more about his father, but this time there was no joke in his voice. Ethan answered the same way, calm and simple. He said his father would come soon, and that he told him to wait right there. The officer pressed his lips together and looked annoyed, but also unsure. He took a step back and glanced at the vehicle again, as if trying to decide whether it mattered. The vehicle stayed still, its windows dark and unreadable. The engine sound steady and calm, not loud, not threatening, just present. Ethan felt his heartbeat slow a little. He remembered the way his father spoke when he told him stories. Not exciting stories, but quiet ones, about patience and awareness, about standing still and watching everything around you. Ethan tried to do that. Now he watched the officer's hands, the way his shoulders stiffened, the way his eyes no longer smiled. The officer radioed something softly, but Ethan could not hear the words. The radio crackled briefly and then went quiet again. The officer sighed and rubbed his forehead, as if the situation was becoming more work than he expected. He told Ethan's mother to stay where she was and not move. She nodded slowly, keeping her hands visible, trying to show she was calm. Ethan looked up at her face and saw fear there, but also trust. She trusted that the truth would protect them, even if it took time. A car passed at the end of the street, but slowed as the driver noticed what was happening. The afternoon light grew softer and shadows stretched longer. The officer paced one step forward, then one step back, his boots scraping lightly against the road. He asked Ethan why he was so sure about his father, and Ethan answered honestly. He said his father never lied to him and that he always came when he said he would. The officer scoffed quietly, but did not laugh this time. Instead, he asked what kind of work Ethan's father did. Ethan paused for a moment, then said he helped protect people. And that was all he knew. The officer looked at him closely, now studying his face, as if searching for signs of a lie. But Ethan's expression did not change. He was scared, but not confused. The officer frowned and glanced at the dark vehicle again. This time, longer than before. Something about its stillness made him uneasy. It was not parked carelessly. It was placed with purpose, straight, aligned and alert. Even while silent, the officer shifted his weight and adjusted his belt, his confidence slipping away little by little. People nearby stayed frozen, watching without moving their eyes, followed every small motion, every change in expression. Ethan felt the world narrow down to this small space, the officer, the vehicle, and himself. He thought about his father again, how he used to kneel to his level, and speak softly, telling him that respect was important, but fear should never control him. Ethan tried to remember those words and stand tall. The officer suddenly asked Ethan's mother for identification. She reached slowly into her bag and handed it over. The officer examined it carefully, taking longer than necessary, his eyes moving between the card and her face, then back again. Ethan felt anger rise in his chest, but he did not speak. He stayed quiet, knowing that speaking now might make things worse. The officer handed the card back and sighed again, his earlier loud energy gone, replaced by irritation mixed with doubt. He muttered something under his breath and looked down the street once more. The dark vehicle remained unmoving, but now it felt closer somehow, even though it had not moved an inch. The officer took a step toward it, then stopped as if remembering his role. He turned back to Ethan and asked him one final time if he was telling the truth. Ethan met his eyes directly, his voice steady when he said, "Yes." The officer searched his face again, and for the first time he saw something that made him pause. Not fear, not pride, but certainty. The kind that does not come from imagination, the kind that comes from knowing. The officer swallowed and stepped back a half step. The crowd sensed the shift and leaned in slightly. Though no one spoke, the wind moved through the street, rustling leaves along the sidewalk. The moments stretched longer and longer. The officer's radio crackled again briefly. This time he responded quietly, turning his body away from Ethan and his mother as he spoke. When he turned back, his expression was tight, controlled, and serious. He told them to remain where they were until things were cleared up. His voice now careful and official, not mocking at all. Ethan felt a strange calm wash over him. His fear was still there, but it was balanced by trust. Trust in his father, trust in the truth. The dark vehicle suddenly turned off its engine. The sound stopped, leaving complete silence. The officer stiffened instantly, his eyes locked onto it. His hand hovered near his belt. Again, people nearby held their breath. Ethan did too, but inside he felt something else, a sense that the waiting was almost over. The officer straightened, his posture forcing authority back into his stance, but it felt fragile like glass. He took one step closer to the vehicle, then stopped again, unsure of what he should do next. Ethan's mother placed a gentle hand on his shoulder, grounding him. The street seemed frozen in time, every second heavy with meaning. The officer had laughed before, and now that laughter felt like a mistake, echoing in his mind. He looked back at Ethan once more and saw not a boy making stories, but a child standing calmly in the middle of pressure, and that realization unsettled him more than anything else. As the silence deepened and the shadows grew longer, it became clear to everyone watching that the officer was no longer in control of the moment, and whatever came next would not be decided by his voice or his badge, but by the truth that was quietly approaching and waiting just out of sight. The moment stretched longer than anyone expected, and the street felt tighter, as if the air itself had grown thick. The officer stood facing the dark vehicle, his shoulders stiff, his jaw set. He tried to look calm, but the small movements betrayed him. The way his fingers tapped against his belt, the way his eyes kept shifting between the vehicle and the small crowd that had gathered. Ethan stood quietly beside his mother, his feet planted firmly on the ground. He felt tired from the fear and the waiting, but he did not move. His eyes stayed fixed on the vehicle, because something deep inside told him this was important. The officer cleared his throat and spoke, again asking everyone to step back. His voice was firm, but lacked the sharp edge it once had. A few people obeyed, slowly taking small steps backward, while others stayed where they were, drawn by curiosity and tension. The officer radioed again, this time his voice low and controlled, as if he did not want to draw attention to his uncertainty. The radio answered with static and short words that only added to the confusion. Ethan watched the officer, carefully noticing how different he looked now compared to earlier, when he had laughed and joked. The confidence was gone, replaced by caution. The dark vehicle remained still, its windows reflecting the golden light of the setting sun, making it impossible to see inside. the silence grew louder than any sound had been before. A bird flew overhead, and its wings cutting through the air felt almost too loud. The officer took a slow step toward the vehicle, then stopped again, his instincts pulling him forward while his doubt held him back. He glanced at Ethan and his mother, and then at the people watching, as if he suddenly realized how many eyes were on him. The pressure of the moment weighed heavily on him. Ethan felt a strange mix of fear and calm. His heart still beat fast, but his breathing slowed. He remembered how his father always said that silence could be powerful if you listened carefully. And so Ethan listened. He listened to the officer's uneven breathing, the faint hum of distant traffic, the rustle of leaves along the sidewalk, the sound of his own thoughts steadying themselves. The officer finally spoke again, his tone careful, asking if anyone was inside the vehicle. There was no answer. The vehicle did not move. The officer shifted his stance and placed his feet wider apart, trying to regain control. He told Ethan's mother again to stay where she was. She nodded without speaking, her hand never leaving Ethan's shoulder, grounding him, reminding him he was not alone. The officer looked down the street, then back at the vehicle, as if expecting something to appear from either direction, but nothing happened, and that nothingness was the hardest part. The waiting gnawed at everyone's nerves. The crowd grew restless. Someone cleared their throat, another person shuffled their feet, but still no one spoke. Ethan's eyes remained steady. He felt a sense of certainty settle in his chest, like a quiet promise. He did not know what exactly would happen, but he knew the truth would show itself soon. The officer's radio crackled once more, and this time he listened carefully, nodding slightly as if receiving instructions. His face tightened, and he glanced at the vehicle again. His confidence tried to return, but it felt forced, like a mask that did not quite fit. He took a breath and walked closer to the vehicle, each step slow, and measured. His boots echoed softly against the road. The sound seemed too loud in the silence. He stopped a few feet away and leaned slightly to peer inside, but the tinted glass revealed nothing. He straightened quickly, stepping back as if he had gotten too close. The crowd watched intently, their eyes following his every move. Ethan noticed the officer's hands trembling just a little, and that surprised him, because earlier the officer had seemed so sure of himself, so untouchable. Now he looked human, uncertain, and vulnerable. The officer turned back to Ethan suddenly and asked him again about his father, but this time his voice was different, quieter, almost respectful. Ethan answered calmly, repeating that his father would come, and that he told them to wait right here. The officer nodded, slowly absorbing the words. He looked at Ethan longer, this time studying the boy's steady gaze and relaxed posture. Despite the tension, the officer seemed to realize something important. That confidence like this did not come from imagination alone. It came from trust, from knowing something was true. The officer exhaled slowly and ran a hand through his hair. The sun dipped lower, casting the street in a warm orange glow that contrasted sharply with the cold tension in the air. The officer looked back at the vehicle, just as a small sound came from inside, a soft click, almost unnoticeable, but loud enough to make everyone freeze. Ethan felt a rush of relief mixed with anticipation. His chest tightened, not with fear now, but with the weight of the moment. The officer stepped back quickly, his hand hovering near his belt again. His eyes locked onto the vehicle. The crowd leaned forward, slightly drawn in by the sudden change. The silence returned thicker than before, and then the vehicle door opened slowly, the sound of it breaking. The quiet felt like a thunderclap. Even though it was soft, a figure moved inside, still mostly hidden by the shadows and tinted glass. The officer straightened immediately, his posture rigid, his earlier authority replaced by alert focus. Ethan's heart pounded, but his face remained calm. He squeezed his mother's hand gently. She squeezed back, her eyes fixed on the opening door. The figure stepped one foot onto the pavement, then paused as if taking in the scene before fully revealing itself. The crowd held its breath. The officer swallowed and adjusted his stance. Preparing for anything, the figure finally stepped out, fully tall and composed, moving with a quiet confidence that commanded attention without effort. He closed the door behind him softly and stood still for a moment, scanning the street. His presence changed the atmosphere instantly. The tension did not disappear, but it shifted, becoming focused and heavy. The officer felt it too. His body reacted before his mind could straighten further. His movements suddenly precise and respectful. He took a small step back without realizing it. Ethan recognized the way the man moved, the calm, the awareness, the quiet strength, and his chest filled with pride. He did not smile. He did not speak. He simply stood there, knowing what this moment meant. The man's eyes found Ethan and softened just slightly, a silent understanding passing between them. The officer noticed this exchange, and his face changed color, the realization dawning slowly and painfully. He understood now that the boy's words had been true all along, but the laughter and mocking had been a mistake. The crowd sensed it too. Murmurs rippled quietly through them as they took in the scene. The officer cleared his throat, but no words came out. The man began to walk toward Ethan and his mother, his steps slow and steady, every movement controlled. The officer stepped aside instinctively, creating a clear path without being asked. The man stopped beside Ethan and placed a calm, reassuring hand on his shoulder. The simple gesture spoke louder than any argument could have. Ethan looked up at him, his fear gone, replaced by trust and relief. The officer stood frozen, watching the moment unfold, knowing now that the balance of power had shifted, and that the truth he had laughed at was standing right in front of him, changing everything. As the street remained silent and the sun dipped below the horizon, the lesson of the moment settled over everyone watching. Respect mattered, patience mattered, and truth always found its way forward, even when doubted and mocked. And as the man stood there with his son, the officer realized that this was only the beginning of his reckoning, and that the choices he made next would follow him far longer than he ever expected. The man stood beside Ethan with calm strength, his hand resting lightly on the boy's shoulder, and that single touch seemed to steady the entire scene. The street no longer felt chaotic, but it was not peaceful either. It felt watched, measured, as if every movement now carried weight. The officer stood a few steps away, his posture stiff, his earlier confidence completely gone. He cleared his throat and tried to speak, but the words came out uneven. He asked who the man was and why he was there. The man did not answer right away. He first looked down at Ethan and gave a small nod, the kind that said, "You did well," without using words. Then he looked at Ethan's mother, his eyes respectful and calm. She met his gaze and felt her fear ease just a little. The man then turned to the officer, his face serious, not angry, not proud, just controlled. He asked the officer why his family had been stopped. The question was simple, but it carried authority. The officer hesitated and glanced at the small crowd that had gathered. He explained quickly that it was a routine check and that there had been confusion in his voice. There was an edge of defensiveness mixed with regret. The man listened without interrupting, his expression unreadable. When the officer finished speaking, the man nodded slowly, as if considering each word carefully. He reached into his jacket and removed an identification card, holding it out without drama. The officer took it with both hands and studied it closely. His eyes widened slightly as he read. His breathing slowed and his shoulders dropped, the reality of the situation settling in. The officer handed the card back with visible respect, his earlier mocking tone now replaced by quiet formality. The crowd watched in silence, sensing the shift. Ethan noticed how the officer no longer looked down at him, but kept his eyes level, aware of his own mistake. The man spoke again, calmly explaining that his work required discretion and patience, and that his family had been instructed to wait where they were till he arrived. His words were firm but not threatening. They carried the weight of experience. The officer nodded repeatedly, apologizing under his breath, though the words felt too small for what had happened. Ethan felt a mix of pride and relief, but also confusion. He had never seen adults change so quickly. The man placed his hand back on Ethan's shoulder, grounding him once more, and then addressed the officer again, this time speaking. About respect, he said that trust was fragile, especially when children were involved, and that words spoken in carelessness could stay with a child longer than intended. The officer listened closely, his head slightly bowed. The crowd remained silent, absorbing the lesson unfolding before them without shouting or anger. The man's calm presence made every word sharper, more powerful than any raised voice could have been. The officer finally apologized directly to Ethan, his voice quiet and sincere. He admitted that he should not have laughed and that he was wrong. Ethan looked at him, unsure of what to say, then glanced up at his father, who gave a small encouraging nod. Ethan spoke softly, saying it was okay, but his voice carried maturity beyond his years. The officer swallowed and nodded, grateful but humbled. The man thanked the officer for acknowledging the mistake and suggested that they all move forward with understanding. The officer agreed quickly, stepping back and signaling for the crowd to disperse. People slowly began to move away, whispering quietly, some with thoughtful expressions, others shaken by what they had witnessed. The street began to return to normal, but the moment lingered, heavy in the air. The man knelt slightly, so he was level with Ethan, and spoke softly, reminding him that courage did not always mean speaking loudly. Sometimes it meant standing still and trusting the truth. Ethan listened carefully, his fear completely gone, replaced by a sense of calm pride. The man then stood and thanked Ethan's mother for her patience. She smiled faintly, her hands still shaking from the tension. Now releasing, she thanked him as well and took a deep breath. The officer stepped aside, allowing them space. As the dark vehicle door opened again, the man guided Ethan toward it, but paused once more. Turning back to the officer, he reminded him that every encounter mattered, and that authority should always come with responsibility. The officer nodded deeply, the lesson clearly etched into his expression. The man and his family entered the vehicle, and as it pulled away slowly, the street felt different, quieter, but not empty. Something had changed, not just for the officer, but for everyone who had watched the truth reveal itself without force. The officer stood alone for a moment, watching the vehicle disappear down the road. He exhaled slowly, the weight of the encounter settling into his thoughts. He realized that his laughter had come from assumption, and that assumption had almost caused harm. As the sun dipped fully below the horizon and the streetlights flickered on, the officer returned to his car, carrying with him a lesson he would not forget. While miles away, Ethan leaned against his seat, feeling safe and proud, knowing that sometimes the strongest moments come not from power but from patience, honesty, and quiet courage. And that day would stay with him forever. As the moment he learned that truth speaks loudest when it does not need to shout. As the vehicle moved away from the street, the silence inside felt different from before. It was calm and safe, but still heavy with emotion. Ethan sat quietly beside his mother, watching the road through the window, the buildings passing slowly. His father sat in the front seat, his posture relaxed now that the tension was gone, but his eyes still alert, as if habit never truly left him. Ethan replayed everything in his mind: the officer's laughter, the waiting, the fear, and then the moment his father stepped out of the vehicle and changed everything without raising his voice. Ethan felt proud, but also thoughtful. He wondered why adults sometimes forgot that words could hurt just as much as actions. His mother broke the silence first, thanking Ethan's father for coming. When he did, he nodded and said he had been watching the situation from a distance longer than they realized, waiting to see how it would unfold, because sometimes lessons needed to reveal themselves naturally. Ethan listened closely, learning that strength was not always about stepping in quickly, but knowing the right moment to act. The vehicle slowed at a red light, and Ethan's father turned slightly to look at him. He asked Ethan how he felt. Ethan thought for a moment and said he had been scared at first, but then he felt sure because he trusted his father. Those words made his father smile softly. He said trust was powerful and that it had helped Ethan stay calm when things felt unfair. The light turned green, and the car moved again. The city noise faded as they entered a quieter road. Ethan's mother looked out the window, her face tired, but relieved. She admitted that she had wanted to speak up earlier, but feared it would make things worse. Ethan's father nodded understanding and told her she had done the right thing by staying calm and protecting Ethan with her presence. Sometimes silence was also a form of strength. Ethan leaned back in his seat, feeling the weight of the day slowly lifting. He realized how close things had come to turning into something worse, and that scared him, but it also made him understand how quickly situations could change. Based on choices and attitudes, the car finally pulled into a quiet parking area near their home. The engine stopped, and the stillness returned. But this time, it was peaceful. They stepped out, and the cool evening air wrapped around them. Ethan felt lighter, as if a burden he had not known he was carrying had been set down. They walked together toward their building, and Ethan noticed how his father walked the same way he always did, steady and aware yet gentle. When he looked at them inside the apartment, the lights were soft and warm, a sharp contrast to the harsh afternoon outside. Ethan sat on the couch while his parents talked quietly in the kitchen. Their voices low but calm. He heard his father explain that respect must be practiced even when authority is involved, because power without understanding leads to mistakes. Ethan absorbed every word, even though they were not spoken directly to him. Later, his father sat beside him and asked what he had learned from the day. Ethan thought carefully and said that telling the truth was important, even when people laughed, and that staying calm could change things. His father nodded proudly and added that forgiveness was also important because people grow when they face their mistakes. Ethan remembered that the officer's face when he apologized and realized that regret could be a heavy thing to carry, but also a chance to become better. The evening passed quietly. Dinner was simple but comforting, and laughter slowly returned to the room, washing away the leftover tension. As night fell, Ethan prepared for bed, his body tired, but his mind still active. His father tucked him in and reminded him that he had been brave, not because he stood up to the officer, but because he stayed honest and calm under pressure. Ethan smiled, feeling safe. He asked his father why the officer laughed in the first place. His father paused, then explained that fear often hides behind laughter, and that some people laugh to feel powerful when they feel unsure. Ethan nodded slowly, understanding more than before. After his father left the room, Ethan stared at the ceiling, thinking about the street, the crowd, and the moment everything changed. He realized that even though the officer had power and a badge, it was the truth that held the real strength, and that strength had arrived quietly, without anger, without shouting. The next morning, Ethan woke up feeling different, as if he had grown overnight at school. He listened more closely, spoke more carefully, and noticed how his words affected others. The memory of the day stayed with him, not as fear, but as guidance, reminding him to treat others with patience, even when they doubted him. Somewhere across the city, the officer began his day too, carrying the weight of the encounter, reflecting on his actions and the lesson learned. Though their paths would likely never cross again, the impact of that moment traveled with both of them, shaping their choices in quiet ways. And in that shared lesson, the real change happened not on the street, not in front of the crowd, but inside, where understanding grows slowly and lasts far longer than laughter ever could. The days that followed moved forward quietly, but the impact of that afternoon stayed alive in small moments that surfaced without warning. Ethan noticed it first in the way his mornings felt calmer, as if he carried a steady balance inside him. He no longer rushed through his thoughts or reacted quickly when something felt unfair. Instead, he paused and remembered how waiting and trust had changed everything that day at school. His teacher once questioned him when he spoke up about an answer others doubted. Before the laughter could grow, Ethan stayed calm and explained himself clearly. And when the teacher realized he was right, Ethan felt the same quiet confidence he had felt on the street. Not pride, but certainty. His classmates noticed too. They began to listen more carefully to him, and Ethan understood that respect often followed calm honesty, not noise at home. His parents spoke more openly about the meaning of responsibility and how every role carried weight. Ethan's father explained that uniforms and titles did not make someone right, choices did, and that even good people could fail when they forgot to listen. Ethan absorbed these words, slowly letting them settle deep inside him. His mother added that kindness was not weakness, and that staying composed in hard moments protected not only others but yourself. Ethan realized that the fear he had felt before had not disappeared completely, but it no longer controlled him. It had become a reminder to stay aware instead of afraid. Meanwhile, the officer could not forget the encounter. No matter how hard he tried during his shifts, he found himself thinking back to the boy's steady eyes and the quiet authority of the man who had stepped out of the vehicle. The laughter that once felt easy now felt heavy and uncomfortable. He noticed how quickly his assumptions had taken control and how close he had come to causing real harm without meaning to. The memory followed him into his interactions. He caught himself before speaking sharply to a driver during a routine stop. He softened his tone and explained instead of demanding. The driver responded calmly, and the situation ended smoothly. The officer felt something unfamiliar. Relief. He began to understand that respect could calm situations faster than force. His fellow officers noticed the change, asking if everything was all right. He did not share details, but simply said he was learning to listen more closely. Each shift became a chance to correct the mistake he had made, not out of guilt alone, but growth back in Ethan's world. The lesson deepened during a school assembly about behavior and respect when the speaker talked about authority and trust. Ethan listened carefully, understanding both sides better than before. He raised his hand and shared a simple thought that trust should go both ways and that listening mattered even when you were in charge. The room fell quiet for a moment, then the teacher nodded approvingly. Ethan felt his cheeks warm, but he stayed composed, knowing that speaking with calm honesty mattered more than attention that night. Ethan dreamed of the street again, but this time it was different. The fear was gone, replaced by clarity. He saw the moment his father stepped forward and how the balance shifted without force. When he woke, he felt rested and sure that the lesson would stay with him for a long time. His father noticed the change too, how Ethan carried himself with quiet confidence and awareness. He told him that real strength often showed itself in small, consistent choices, not one big moment. Ethan nodded, understanding that day had been a beginning, not an ending. Weeks passed and life continued with normal routines, but the meaning of that moment continued to echo subtly in decisions and attitudes. Ethan became more patient with younger students, more understanding when others made mistakes. He remembered the officer's apology and saw how difficult it had been, and he learned that growth often came through discomfort. His parents noticed how he spoke with more care and listened with more intention. One evening, his father sat with him and explained that regret could be a powerful teacher if faced honestly, and that the officer had likely learned a lesson that day, just as Ethan had. Ethan felt a strange sense of peace, knowing that something good had come from something painful somewhere else. The officer stood before a mirror at the end of a long shift, removing his badge. Slowly he thought about how close he had been to becoming someone he did not want to be, and how easily power could blind good judgment. He promised himself to never let laughter replace listening again. The image of the boy standing calmly stayed with him, reminding him that authority should protect, not belittle. As time went on, both lives moved forward in separate paths, but the shared moment remained a turning point, shaping values and decisions without needing reminders. It lived quietly in everyday choices, in patience, in restraint, in respect, and in the understanding that real authority was not proven by volume or control, but by fairness and awareness. And in that quiet transformation, the regret that once burned sharp slowly turned into wisdom, guiding both a child and an officer toward better versions of themselves.